constitutionalist. What change would you bring that doesn't already exist in the Constitution? Or maybe what changes would you make that would get us back to the Constitution?
Well, I'd be happy just to go back to the Constitution. I mean, we say we're rule of law sorts of people, but we violate the Constitution all the time. So I would be a big fan of merely returning to the Constitution. There might be some things I would change in an optimal world, but we have deviated so far from the Constitution. I would just be happy just to stick with that and move back to that. On the topic of change, this is a favorite one of mine because people talk about change all the time. Well, now you have a highly credible candidate, an economics professor. If you want change, what better opportunity do you have than this? 40% of voters say that they're independent. Well, if you want an independent choice, here's your chance. So are we going to vote for the same old that we've been doing for 100 years? We've voted ourselves into all kinds of problems with the two-party system the last 100 years. And I think it's time for real change. I agree. I agree with all the people who talk about change. But I don't think we need the kind of change we've been having where we kind of flip back and forth between mostly the same old. I think we need real change. We need libertarians. We need to go back to the Constitution. We need not to depend on the federal government to try and solve all of our problems. And that's only going to happen if we have a true change. And voters in the 9th District have that choice. And what are they going to do with it? I'm really curious to see. Thank you.
Well, everyone's now aware of this economic crisis. It seems, we're not paying as much attention to the destruction of wild forests around the globe and how that's costing society far more. I know estimates range from 2 to 5 trillion every year. I'd like to know what your priorities are for protecting our free-running streams, our forests, our natural ecosystems. Just where do you stand in that realm?
When you look at the Constitution and you think about libertarians, we defend life, liberty, and property. And one of the areas where that's not well defined is in areas of pollution, because property rights are not well defined. So for example, if I own property and you dump a bunch of stuff on it, well, we can handle that through the courts. But if you dump something into a stream that no one owns or into the air that no one owns, I can't take you to court over that. Well, the government can take you to court. So that's what's called a market failure or a market struggle, and that's an area where there is room for government intervention to be done. That said, there's no promise that government's intervention will be especially effective, but there is certainly a role for government in dealing with pollution because private market actors will not likely take care of these sorts of things on their own. They have an incentive to overforest, to pollute rivers and whatever. I think we also need to knock out all the subsidies for ranching and forestry. There should be none of that. I should never take your money to give to a company to cut down trees or to pay ranchers to graze on lands. Those sorts of subsidies should be knocked out. But yeah, there's a role for government in dealing with pollution.
Being as you're in the educational occupation, I'm sure you've seen changes in funding in schools. There's been a lot of emphasis put on science and math. How do you plan to provide funding to equally important subjects like art and vocational programs?
Again, I see no federal role for education. No Child Left Behind is not helpful and not within the purview of what the Constitution would hold. Again, why should we take money from to deal with state and local problems at the federal level? And it doesn't make any sense. Over and over again, we have state and local problems, and we say to Washington, will you fix this for us? And they say, sure, just send us a bunch of your money. We'll take some of it, we'll attach a bunch of strings to it, and we'll send it back to you, and then you can fix your state and local problems. Well, it seems to me it's a lot smarter to just say, if we have a problem in Indiana, and we want to fund art education in Indiana, which would be a wonderful thing, why don't we just take care of our business here instead of sending that money to Washington? Why should people in Wyoming pay for a program in Indiana? Why should people in Indiana pay for a program in Vermont? It doesn't make any sense. It's not effective, it's not equitable, it's not constitutional. So again, I would see no federal role for those sorts of things.
This is on term limits. Should the Senate and the Congress have term limits? And if there were term limits, should Congress maybe be extended to more than 2 years?
And part of my dissertation was on term limits, actually, and some of my academic research is on term limits. And we thought it would show that it affected spending, and actually the effects are fairly trivial. It doesn't really change very much, much to our surprise. I think this goes back to the earlier question about campaign finances, which is, term limits are fine, but I think they're window dressing because, again, it goes back to the sort of congressman we elect, the sort of things we want Congress to do. And basically you're shuffling chairs on the Titanic, in my view, when you decide to send different people back. It's not who we send in terms of shuffling the chairs, it's the type of people we spend and what they want the government to do. And we need to go back to a place where we have fiscal sanity in Washington, where the government is not bloated, where it doesn't seek to bail out thing after thing after thing, industry after industry after industry. And really, term limits doesn't really speak to that. Would I support term limits? Sure. But I don't see that as it's very much, I think, a secondary issue. I think it's window dressing. It doesn't change very much.
Would you have voted for the bailout?
Absolutely not, Kathy. Absolutely not. The difficult thing about the bailout, I would have supported some modest reforms that wouldn't have cost money, like the FDIC extension. That's largely symbolic, but when you're dealing with the monetary and banking systems, you're dealing with faith and trust, and that faith and trust has been grossly violated lately. So a symbolic gesture like that would be fine. Changing the accounting rules or suspending mark-to-market would be, I think, a wonderful thing. Would have helped a lot. You can get rid of the capital gains tax as far as I'm concerned, let alone suspending it for a while. So I think there's some things we could have done, but why on earth we give $700 billion to the very people who messed this up? It makes no sense to me at all. And then on top of that, I really am impressed by the courage they had to slip that extra $150 billion in there. It takes remarkable courage to do that kind of spending in the midst of an emergency. So that's the kind of leadership we have in Washington these days. And when the Republicans are leading the charge for that kind of spending, who's left? Again, we have to come back to fiscal sanity. I mean, we've been trying to bail this economy out all year long, maybe because it's election year, but $168 billion for this and $25 billion for that, and after a while it's real money, and we just can't do that anymore.
Thank you.
What are your plans to enforce border control and to crack down on illegal immigration?
Any coherent strategy on illegal immigration has to do two things. It has to enforce things at the border, and that's easier said than done, so we shouldn't be utopian about what that would look like. And the second thing is that you have to enforce laws against the businesses that hire illegals. That's the reason they're coming. And one of my opponents does not want to do that at all, but that is incoherent to say that we're going to completely ignore illegals once they get here and not enforce those laws. So you have to do both of those things. At the same time, it's easier said than done. I think some people say, well, you just deport 12 million people, or you just put up a fence. Well, it's not that easy. So I think we need to be realistic, but we need a two-pronged approach to deal with that issue.
Let's go back to the bailout. Shouldn't we have seen this coming?
Absolutely. I mean, you have the government stepping in again in an area where it doesn't belong. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, where's their license in the Constitution that the government should be dealing with home mortgages? I must have missed that in the Constitution. And to expect that the government would handle that very well. On top of that, once the government starts down the road of bailing things out, then people take risks because they know if the risks pay off, they'll make the big bucks, and they know if the risks don't work out, they'll be bailed out by somebody. And so it's inherently flawed. Economists call this the moral hazard problem. So it's not difficult to expect that this would happen. In terms of all the debt we've rung up, no economist can tell you what the magic number is, where that cliff is. There is some number out there where you can't go any further, and then people won't loan you any money, and then you got to print a lot of money or default on your debt. But what we can tell you, what I can tell you, is that we are in a car driving the wrong direction. I'm not sure if we're 500 feet from the edge of that cliff or 5 miles from the edge of that cliff, but we're in a car going the wrong direction fast. And unless we bring fiscal sanity back to D.C., it's going to get uglier. We have to stop what we're doing.
Thank you so much. I believe you have about 20 seconds for an open mic, just to say whatever you'd like to say.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. Again, I would exhort you, if you want real change, I would encourage you to check out my website, ericforcongress.com. If you're independent, really, I give you an opportunity to sleep better at night. I hope you'll consider my candidacy on these issues and the other issues that we've talked about, and I appreciate your consideration. Don't waste your vote this time. Vote Schansberg November 4th.
Thank you, Mr. Schansberg. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the televised portion of tonight's